This program is brought to you by Stanford University.
I think we'll begin. I'm Peter Stansky, the co-chair of the program committee of the Stanford Historical Society, and it's a great personal and professional pleasure for me to introduce my dear colleague Al Camarillo. We've been colleagues since 1975. When he joined, having been educated in South Central Los Angeles and at UCLA, both a BA and a PhD, he then joined the Stanford faculty, where he's had an absolutely stellar, fantastic career in the succeeding years. He now is a chaired professor. He's a prolific author. And I think he's probably the world's leading historian of the Latino experience in America. In 7 books, 2 of which have been frequently reprinted and are the standard texts in the field. And I shouldn't say personally, he's also been wonderfully involved in the public sector with the Haas Center, with courses that are involved with outreach. He's really been a fantastic addition to the Stanford University, and he's been absolutely a fantastic colleague, for which I'm personally am deeply grateful. Al Camarillo.
Thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction. But I think you also knocked out my no, there it is, my PowerPoint. No, just kidding. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. We could have retired to a seminar room, perhaps, instead of this big lecture hall. But nonetheless, I do have some PowerPoint photos I want to show you, which reflect some of the things I'm going to talk about, especially about students. It's interesting that after so many years at Stanford, this is the second occasion in the last month, that I've been asked to reflect on my years at Stanford and the Latino community. Last month, the students at Casa Zapata, the Chicano theme dorm, asked me to come talk about Casa Zapata, and the students have lived there for over three decades. And of course, I'm delighted to be with you this evening to reflect in a much more structured way, think about not only students, but the role of faculty and institutional change. This is something I've been thinking a lot about frequently, and I'm not sure quite how to interpret the invitations. Now, could it be that, in fact, people think I've been here so long that I do indeed have a perspective willing to share, or, and I got this from the students, we better get him now, because we don't know if he'll remember things in a few years. So let's get him to come talk to us now. But in any event, I'm delighted to do this. I was telling some of the folks earlier that this is part of partly autobiographical work that I'm conducting now. It's both a scholarship, but it's autobiographical. I'm writing about the place that I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, a place called Compton. Growing up there during amazing change, and then leaving, going off into a career in higher education, and 30 years later, going back to that place, and a very different type of place today, and telling that story. But the editor wants me to, in fact, incorporate my years in Stanford into this narrative, which I'm happy to do, and this forced me, in fact. So I was delighted when Peter said, we would like you to talk about Latinos at Stanford, because it gave me an opportunity to think, in a more structured way about the experiences which I've been a part of now for 34 years. The history of Latinos at Stanford is it's a story of institutional change. It's a story about educational opportunity, being open to a population that prior to the late 1960s, had virtually no experience with higher education. It's a story about Stanford. It's about a story about a new group of students and how they changed the institution and how the institution changed them. It's about a group of faculty who began to be hired in the 1970s, of which I was a part, and their story, my story, that is woven into the fabric of the institution. Right? But it's also a history, it's a story about American society in the last third of the 20th century. So what I want to do is just reflect on some of these experiences, talk about students. Let's see if we can get this going here. Yeah, let me go back. So what I'd like to briefly talk about is, I'll start with some definitions because there's oftentimes a lot of ambiguity or misunderstanding about labels, about terminology. So I'll just spend a couple minutes on terminology. But I want to talk about Mexican-American students, Chicano students at Stanford. Then I'll switch to talk about Chicano or Mexican-American faculty and the university. And then talking about Latinos in general, Stanford as an institution, and how it gives us a window into understanding some profound changes that affected American higher education, that affected Stanford University in the last third of the 20th century. Well, first some definitions, because there are many terms that have been used over time, to this day, many confusing terms. Now, we can use interchangeably Mexican-American and Chicano in the same sentence, the same paragraph. But I want to bring a distinctive note to the term Chicano because it's a term that goes back at least 90 to 100 years used within Mexican-American community, Mexican immigrant communities in the American Southwest, from Texas to California. But it was a term that took on a different meaning in the immediate post-civil rights era. It became a term of pride, of ethnic pride. It became a politicized term that my generation, the students who went to school in the late 1960s as undergraduates and high school students as well, it was a term of pride. It was a term of one identifying oneself as a more political Mexican origin person in the United States. Right? So the term Chicano, though historic, because I can recall in my own community, that would refer to the other Chicano families down the street. But that was a term used exclusively within the community. But by the 60s, by 1967, 1968, 69, this term is infused with ethnic nationalism, with a political orientation. But we still can use it interchangeably with Mexican American. Now, today, it's a term that's not widely used. Right? It's a term that, other than on college campuses, is not used much. In fact, we hear more the term Latino or Hispanic. Those two terms can be used interchangeably. Latino or Hispanic means the Spanish origin people of the United States. Right? They could be Puerto Rican, they could be Cuban, they could be South American. Two-thirds of these people in the United States are of Mexican origin. So Hispanic and Latino can be used interchangeably. A whole bunch of other terms that people have used. La raza literally means the race, but means the people. And it's usually for people of Mexican origin, but not exclusively. And the term Mexican origin. Or if we go to particular states, we were talking about New Mexico. You wouldn't use the term Chicano in New Mexico, right? There was a distinctive history in that particular part of the Southwest, and a lot of people would either refer to themselves as Spanish Americans or Hispano. Or if you went to Texas, instead of calling oneself Mexican American or Chicano or Latino, you might refer to yourself as a Tejano. So there's a whole bunch of terms. I'm mostly going to use Mexican American and Chicano, but I will refer to, in the end of the lecture, about Latinos. Well, let me start by talking about the sequential development of a population of students who were new to Stanford University. New for the first time as a group. Now, we've discovered that back in the 1920s, there was a young woman by the name of Dominguez who, as far as we can determine, was the first Mexican-American graduate of Stanford University. And there were probably just a few others who had graduated up until 1968 and 1969. Now, I can use that as a benchmark, right? Because it's the year that the first substantial group of Chicano or Mexican-American students, but as well African-American students on campus. So the difference between just a few individuals and a group that identifies itself as a group and starts making demands on the university, starts changing the university, and in the process are themselves being changed. So some of the benchmarks, and you have to think about this, because I can relate to it very well because I was part of that generation at a different institution, right? The first year, 1969, was the first substantial group, cohort of Mexican-American students, about, from as far as we can tell, 70 or 80 students were admitted in that class as they matriculate through Stanford through the early 1970s. It was a profoundly new, oftentimes disturbing experience for those first kids out of the mostly barrios of Los Angeles and South Texas. And I'll come back to that in a minute because there was an interesting distinction of the Mexican-American student population that I discovered when I stepped foot on campus first in 1974 as I was interviewing and talking with students, and then when I started my career in 1975. But I'll come back to that in a minute. But there are some important benchmarks that we have to understand. New population of students, small, adjusting to a fundamentally different experience than anything that had ever come before. Now, you have to understand this. African Americans had a substantial, long history of higher education because of the historically black colleges. So there was a substantial African American middle class over the course of the 20th century that come out of the historically black colleges. Nothing ever existed like that for Latinos, for Hispanic people. Nothing at all. So that generation that came on to Stanford or UCLA where I started, it was altogether new. This is a different story, one that I'm also trying to tell, but in a different context. But I can relate it to you just in comparison. And some of the students have heard this before. When I started UCLA, this was a long time ago. When I say 1966, oh my God, that's a Pleistocene age. In 1966, when I started UCLA, there were 28,000 undergraduates. There were 1.5 million Mexican origin people that lived in the Southern California region. There were 42 Mexican Americans at UCLA when I started. I was 43rd, and my brother was 44th, so we don't count them. Out of 28,000 students with 1.5 million Mexican origin people in the region, we were the first ever to step foot on that campus, right? The second largest public university in the state of California. That was the state of higher education and minority students, the historically underrepresented minority students. So my experience at UCLA was in a way paralleled by those students that came in 1969 to Stanford, right? And we're beginning to take advantage of this amazing opportunity to come to this great university, at the same time trying to grapple with what it meant to be a part of the Stanford community. Now, there's some important benchmarks. One was the Office of the President for Chicano Affairs, and started, I think, I may be wrong about this. I actually have to do a little archival work on this. I think it was started in 1970. Luis Nogales was the first person who held that office. Let's see, let me get you a picture of Luis here. I think it was 1969. And the first staff member at Stanford who worked directly with the president and was an advocate for the new cohort of Chicano Mexican-American students and was appointed by the president to serve as that liaison to that group of students and was important in laying some of the initial institutional connections for Chicano students at Stanford. Another benchmark I just mentioned. So we have to talk as well about student groups. By 1968, There was a consolidation of Mexican-American student organizations across Southwestern universities. Again, the first cohort of Mexican-Americans at University of Texas, University of New Mexico, Arizona State, University of Arizona, Berkeley, other places. And in 1968, they come together in a conference, in conferences, to establish one umbrella organization, MECHA. Now, let me just mention, Luis Nogales was very important in talking with the admissions office, just as affirmative action, right? Just as affirmative action policies were being implemented, saying Stanford has to be a part of this process of opening the doors of higher education to kids who come from communities that historically been excluded from Stanford and other universities. So I remember Luis well. He went on. He's a former trustee of the university for about 8 years in the early 90s and mid 90s. But I wanted to mention him in particular because he's so important to the origins of this Mexican-American community at Stanford. But the student groups were an interesting group of young people. Of course, I met them in 74 and 75, and they already were by that time fully ensconced at the university. They felt by that time that they had become part of the Stanford community, but still grappling with what it meant to be an ethnic minority at a predominantly white institution, right? But carving out niches for themselves, student activities, curriculum, the first few faculty that are their mentors, and these are the important connectors, if you will, to this student population, to the university. So MECHA stands for the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, or the Chicano Student Movement of Aztlán. Aztlán was a term that came out of the Chicano movement. It was a mythical homeland of what people were referring to then as the origins of the Chicano population. Now, it's mythical, right? It's mythical. But it was something that my generation latched onto as a source of ethnic pride and identity, right? Origins, Aztec origins, indigenous origins of this population. Part European, we didn't emphasize that, right? Not then. Indigenous, yes, we emphasize that. Unique group in the Americas, yes. Unique group in the American Southwest, yes. So these are the things that MECHA, and MECHA exists today. In fact, there's going to be, I understand, a reunion, Francis, this year? May 2nd. So a 20 or a 40-year anniversary of MECHA at Stanford and other places. So important grounding for Mexican Americans to come together. Now, just a few anecdotes. I remember when I first came to Stanford, and so the community was so small that whenever a prospective Chicano faculty member was recruited on campus, they called a community meeting. Now, these meetings were called for monthly. And believe me, everyone showed up. 50, 80 students, few staff. We didn't have many staff, and very few, count the faculty on one hand, right? But everyone showed up to these. And I said to myself, this is quite a cohesive community. And then after I started in 75, I realized there were some interesting distinctions within this community. Homogeneous in one way. They were virtually all working class. Virtually all working class, either first or second generation born in the United States. And they came from two distinctively different places. They came from where I came from, Los Angeles. There was a large group of Mexican-American kids, especially from East LA. And I can identify with these kids because I grew up in LA. But this other group I had never had contact with before. They were the Tejanos. And not just Tejano, they were from the Rio Grande Valley, distinctive Tejanos, right? Coming from the border region of Texas and Mexico. And though the students got along very well together, it was a community. I used to love to see the bantering and the play between the Tejanos and the Californianos, because the Californian, the LA Chicanos say, those South Texans, they're so traditional, right? They're so Catholic, and they speak so much Spanish, and then the Chicano kids from East LA and LA in general, these are urban kids that grew up, they were second generation, they didn't speak Spanish as well, so the Tejanos say, los Chicanos de Islos no hablan español muy bien, and they've lost their culture but this is the kind of but it was a community. But maybe the only place, the only university in the Southwest where you had this interesting connection of students drawn from South Texas and Southern California. Not exclusively, but principally from those areas. There was a reason for this. The admissions office, when it first went out, had people who were from Brownsville, Texas, Reynoso, Texas, other places in South Texas. So they went back to these regions to recruit the students. And then the other group of people were going back to their areas in Southern California. So there was a reason why there were Tejanos and Californianos at that time. But it was an interesting passing phase, I should say, because that didn't last long. The Chicano Mexican student population began to change. We can't talk about Stanford Chicano students unless we talk about Casa Zapata. It was one of the first institutional groundings for Chicano students at Stanford. The ethnic residences, the theme dorms, right? And it's played an important role in the lives of hundreds, thousands of students over time. I was good friends with Arturo Pacheco, the first resident fellow, as a professor in the School of Education, had received his PhD from Stanford as well. And then two other people who left their stamp on Casa Zapata were Tony and Cecilia Burcial. You can see that Tony was an amazing artist, muralist, and this is one of the many, many murals that adorn the walls in Casa Zapata and in Stern Hall. And this was, I don't know who did this, but they superimposed Tony and Cecilia over one of his famous murals in the dining hall. But this place, Casa Zapata, was a home, but it was family, and it was community. It was a place where people felt comfortable, right? And it gave them the connection they needed to launch their careers at Stanford, to feel at home, right? Because it was difficult, especially those early years, to be detached, away from your community, away from your family. As true for all Stanford students, but especially for these ethnic communities, and Ujamaa served the same purpose for African Americans early on. So Casa Zapata is one of those important Stanford institutions that one cannot talk about the evolution of the Chicano community and Stanford student community without talking about Casa Zapata in the same paragraph. You can see, again, many of these incredible. If you ever get a chance, go over to Stern Hall. There's some amazing artwork up on these walls, and I always marvel at them. And they were done by professional muralists who incorporated students into doing the artwork, so they tell a history unto themselves. Now, something that I remember well coming here, because by the time I got to Stanford, this program called the Chicano Fellows Program had already been in operation for a few years. And it was, for a long time, the closest and the only thing that Stanford undergraduates had that we could call Chicano Studies curriculum, right? It was a group of students who, and I guess Luis Nogales had to be responsible for this again, to convince the administration to provide some graduate student teaching fellowships for advanced graduate students who would teach courses in their fields of expertise. So you had 3 or 4 or 5, as many as 7 or 8 graduate students any given year teaching courses, Chicano studies courses, right? And in these early years, particularly important because the number of faculty teaching these courses was tiny. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So it's what we call the origins of Chicano studies curriculum at Stanford. And over time, the faculty had a greater role in monitoring what the students were teaching, because there was a time when there wasn't much monitoring, and the students got carried away with some of these courses, but that's a different story. But nonetheless, laid the groundwork for a curricular development that would take on new iterations over time, and I'll talk about that when I talk about the 1990s. But there's another institution that we have to talk about with regard to Chicano students. It comes a little later. It comes at the end of this early decade, in 1978. El Centro Chicano. I was asking Francis Morales, who's been the director for 20 years, about the Mecha reunion. But this is a place that's near and dear to the hearts of hundreds of Mexican-American students over time. It was carved out of a dungy, dark, dank basement in the Nitery of Old Union. It's still there, but it's been renovated. Believe me, you go there now, it really looks nice. When I got there, and I'm sure Francis remembers this, it was not a very desirable space. This is where the Chicano Fellows Program was located, and then as we made the proposal to create El Centro Chicano, this is where the two would occupy that basement of Old Union. It provided social, cultural, and other types of activities for those students who wish to have that part of their experience at Stanford, right? And as much as Casa Zapata, El Centro became one of the pillars for Chicano students at Stanford over a long period of time. I remember vividly the discussion that we had in the basement of the Nitery in, I think it was a cold winter night. The community came out. There had to be 50, 60 people. A few of the faculty, a couple of the faculty, and the university accepted the proposal, and we were ready to name the place. And you can imagine with undergraduates and graduate students, names were flying all over the place. Now, I remember this one in particular. There was this graduate student in humanities, creative guy. And I think he wanted to name it something like Centro Actividades Chicanos de Aztlán, or Chicano Activities Center of Aztlán. And I said, do you know what the acronym of that place would be when your parents come by and see it? CACA? No. So we settled, El Centro Chicano. But it's interesting, the formal name is El Centro Chicano de Stanford. So they put a little, twist on Stanford. They refer to El Centro Chicano, but it's El Centro Chicano de Stanford. But it became another home, and an important place for student organizations. And they, too, would evolve over time. So the initial student organizations were housed in the Nitery in El Centro Chicano. So that's the first phase. And of course, I remember it fondly because I came here as a 26-year-old assistant professor, and I had, strong relationships with the students and the staff and the few faculty that came in with me, or a little before me or a little after. And all these places have really warm spot in my heart because it's where I started my career here. And they for me, Casa Zapata, El Centro Chicano, all these others were important grounding points for me, in addition to my colleagues in the history department. But things change, right? There's growth. There's diversity within the student population. The institution itself is becoming more sophisticated in its outreach to students of color and students in general. And one of the things that certainly was true of the Mexican-American students in the 1980s and 1990s, you can say that it matured as a population, one, because it grew, whereas the initial classes were 1 to 1.5, maybe 2% of the total admitted students in the class. By the mid-1980s and early 1990s, it had grown to 8, 9, 10% of the entering class. So there'd been a substantial outreach. But that outreach of students, it was no longer just the kids from Southern California and South Texas. Now we were getting kids who were reflecting a different class status. These were the first substantial cohort of Mexican-American middle-class kids, now growing up in middle-class household, professional parents, and this was a real change from the early cohort. Also, what I would call an intellectual diversity. Early on, I'd say those early years, students were primarily interested in the social sciences and to a lesser extent the humanities. But by these years, the 80s and the 90s, the blossoming of the Chicano pre-professional organization. So for the first time now, you have, where you didn't have that first decade, the pre-med, Chicano pre-meds, the Chicano pre-law students, the Chicano engineers. So intellectual diversity was beginning to be reflected in the student clientele, the student population that Stanford was admitting. Another thing, too, geographic diversity. We were getting students for the first time from places like Chicago and New Mexico and Arizona. Northern California begins to have a substantial number of students in each admitted class. So there was a geographical diversity as well, which speaks to the diaspora of Mexican origin people in the United States. But those early years, it was far and few between the students that were outside California and Texas. The more recent phase, again, you'd have to look at and some of this is anecdotal. I could back it up with archival material as well, which I probably will do, just to get the facts right. I have my colleague Peter Stansky, and of course he'd have put footnotes into this, right? But it was a changing demographic profile of the Stanford undergrad, Mexican-American undergrad student again. And here's the way I would characterize that population. Clearly, the middle class had already emerged in that second phase, but increasingly, the middle class, upper middle, affluent Mexican-American students for the first time. These are students of quite wealthy parents. Few, not many, but clearly this was not visible in the 1960s and 1970s. But by the more recent last 15 years or so, we see an increasing diversity, socioeconomic diversity. Juxtapose that to an interesting, again, I think, and we can explain this with the admissions office, conscious decision on the admissions office to do what? To make sure that Stanford is a place that promotes opportunity. It becomes a springboard for people that come from communities and families without much in terms of socioeconomic status. So at the same time, you have increasing middle and upper middle class Mexican-American, Latino students. You also have students that, what I call the fourth wave, the products of the fourth wave. There have been 4 major waves of immigration from Mexico. Mexican Revolution, 1910 to about 1930. The Bracero era that we call 1940s, actually goes into the 1960s, early 60s. The undocumented and documented migrations of the 1950s, all very large, right? All very large, but unprecedented immigration since 1965. The largest wave of immigration from Mexico in the nation's history. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of people. Their children are coming of age, and they're setting their sights to institutions of higher learning and the elite institutions. And it's amazing that these students are performing so incredibly well, but coming from such humble origins and being able to be admitted to Stanford University. That's amazing to me. And so we have a group of students that come from, in fact, in a way, reflecting what the earliest generation was. Coming from humble origins, These are working class communities, working class families with immigrant parents. And so we have this diversity, an interesting diversity in our student population, our Mexican origin population, Latino population in general. And here's where we'd have to use the term Latino too, because there are students other than Mexican origin students that call themselves Hispanics. So there are some South American students, so foreign students, but a scattering of other students, Cuban Americans, Puerto Ricans, etc. But overwhelmingly, still, the Latino population and student population at Stanford is of Mexican origin. And then for me, it's interesting because I'm a historian of Mexican American and other groups that have come to American society and adapted themselves, and they take on interesting identities, and those identities shift over time. So we have students now that claim multiple identities, multiple ethnic identities. The product of biracial marriages, right? So they come, they don't want to be scratched out in this box as only Hispanic. They are something else. It's true for African American population as well, by the way. Increasingly biracial, bicultural, with mixed identities. And this adds an interesting mix to the undergraduate population. And then last for me, which has really been fun, but really makes me feel old, the students, the children of my first students, bless their hearts. And they come up to me and say, my mom, you know her by her maiden name. She just wanted to say hello. And I said, oh, my goodness, that can't be. A child already at Stanford? But yes, the alums have been prolific. And they are sending their children to Stanford. And it's so special for me to have 2 generations of students now that I will have been here long enough to educate 2 generations from the same family. Okay. I was going to show you a little clip, but I think for the sake of time, I'll just mention this to you. We're going to try to get this back up on a website, but the students a few years ago did this remarkable project of recovery of students, Mexican American student history at Stanford. It's called Crónicas. And they talked to alums, and they collected photographs, and they put a narrative together. And it really beautifully tells, I think, the story of students, Mexican American students at Stanford. So Francis and I are going to try to work to get this website that has this amazing photograph collection, as well as Crónicas online, so that it's available to everyone. Okay. It's a different story when we talk about faculty. It's a very different story, primarily because of the following. When a program of affirmative action, early on as it's implemented in institutions of higher learning across the country in universities, centralized through admissions. When admissions policies change, they are centralized, they can have profound impact in a relatively short period of time. So the diversity of the Stanford undergraduate population, because of policies implemented from the president to the provost on down to the dean of admission, can change the profile of a student undergraduate population. But for graduate students and faculty, that process is not decentralized. It's still firmly held in the hands of faculty in their departments and their schools. And that's been much more difficult to change over time. So when I came to Stanford in 1975, that's actually supposed to be, 1975. I was the 6th Mexican-American person appointed at Stanford in the history of the institution. And I was only the 3rd person to ever teach Chicano studies-related courses. Right? I was another statistic on thinking about the production of faculty. I was the 2nd PhD in American history to be trained in Mexican American history in the United States, and I got my PhD in 1975. When I started graduate school, there were 12 Mexican American PhDs in the nation out of 6 million people. Right? So there had been no opportunity to come into places like Stanford to be trained. But that was going to change, but it was slow to change. Again, primarily because the institution can change and policy can change, but departments and schools determine the profile of their colleagues. And again, that has changed, but it's been the slowest thing in terms of Latinos or Mexican Americans at Stanford to change. You can see these numbers, and these numbers are inflated because if I were to say Mexican Americans, in 1975 there were 9 Mexican Americans at the university. The numbers you see are Hispanic faculty, so there are other faculty, most of whom were born and educated outside the United States. 24 in 1988. In 2008, it's 52. This is out of a faculty of 1,600, right? So the slow, painful increase in the number of Mexican-American faculty. But as I tell the faculty that we're recruiting now, it's not so much the numbers as what you can do as a faculty member, as a member of the faculty at this institution to change the institution. And that's what a group of faculty started to do in the 1970s and through the 1980s and 1990s to the present, trying to, at the same time, move forward the state of knowledge about this group and other groups, but at the same time pushing the boundaries of the institutional commitment for change, pushing the doors a little further open so that this great university and others like it are more diverse and they reflect more of what this nation is about. All right, so the faculty at the university. So some benchmarks again. I mentioned the Chicano Fellows Program, and by the late 70s, early 80s, the Chicano faculty, myself included, are overseeing this program with the graduate students. So it's like an incipient Chicano Studies program, but it's not a degree-granting program. Right? It's unlike the only other ethnic studies major at Stanford is African American studies. And there's no other, at this time, there's no other degree granting program other than African American studies. Chicano Fellows Program was a curricular-based program, but not degree granting. Important development in 1980, the Stanford Center for Chicano Research. So there are enough faculty now that come together. They go to Provost Don Kennedy, soon to become President Don Kennedy, and make the case, we think we have a small but important cohort of faculty and graduate students that can create a center to facilitate the research, social science and humanities research on Mexican origin people in the United States. And he agreed, and we started the Stanford Center for Chicano Research, and it lasted for over 16 years. But something else was important in the development of research and faculty interests. The first effort to bridge the Latino subgroups and the research that was being carried on by by faculty at different institutions. So we created in 1983 the Inter-University Program for Latino Research, and it was founded here at Stanford in 1983. It's still it continues to this day. Started with 4 institutions. The City University of New York, the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños, Puerto Rican Studies Center, the Chicano Studies Center at UCLA, Stanford's Center for Chicano Research, and the University of Texas had a Mexican American Studies Center and Research Center. Now it includes 21 universities, at that time just 4. But what it allowed us to do is to reach out to Puerto Rican faculty who are in New York, Cuban American faculty who are in Florida, and then Mexican American faculty at places like University of Texas, University of New Mexico, and Arizona, and we formed a coalition, if you will, confederation of organizations and faculty. That was very important to see kind of a larger Latino research agenda emerging with larger number of faculty. So relatively small number of faculty at Stanford, Chicano faculty, but when you came to what we call the IUPLR, there were larger constellations. So you could begin to see the change across the country in terms of the faculty that are being appointed. Now, more recently, what I'd call the institutionalization of Mexican American studies and research But within a larger framework was the benchmark establishment of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity in 1996. And as a part of that center, the creation of other ethnic studies majors for the first time. So Asian American Studies, Native American Studies, and Chicano Studies for the first time at Stanford become degree-granting programs. So that's a milestone. That was an important milestone. And so students, if they so wish, can, through this program, either study an ethnic-specific focus on an ethnic group in particular, or they can study comparative studies in race and ethnicity. So look at two or more groups in American society or domestic international groups, ethnic groups in the United States or in other countries. The push to augment the number of faculty continues. It's a never-ending story. It is one of finding the right candidates, the right department, the right school, making the case that this would be an important appointment to the department or the school or the university. The provost a year and a half ago, greatly facilitated this process when he gave 10 faculty positions to CCSRE to make these appointments in the study of race and ethnicity. And just this last year, 2 new Mexican-American faculty joined Stanford, one in political science, Gary Segura, and Tomas Jimenez in sociology. And so they will continue to expand the research and teaching capability in not only Chicano studies, but in other areas as well. And this faculty development initiative continues. Let me end by talking a little bit about how this fits in to a larger context. So we can look at Stanford. We can look at any of the universities that are going through comparable changes, right? But it's part of a larger phenomena that is changing higher education, diversifying institutions of higher learning. That first period clearly is one of inclusion. The first students are admitted to Stanford. The first faculty, Chicano faculty, are hired at Stanford. The first staff are hired at the university. And this constitutes that community that is, especially with the faculty and the graduate students, because these are the faculty that are doing the research and doing the publications, and the graduate students that we are training, and they themselves will go out and become the faculty, the next generation, next cohort of faculty at institutions across the land. But this was just the incipient period. This is when the first cohorts of these students and faculty and staff show up in higher education. And if you look at Chicano studies per se or Latino studies, it's just a foothold. It's a tiny foothold, but an important intellectual foothold in universities such as Stanford. And there was still at this time, if one went to the historical association meetings or the sociological or anthropological, and there were a very small number of people of color at these organization meetings, and they were still kind of on the margin, right? Their research was still being contested. Is it really valid for someone of that group to study their own group? And so there were questions like this, but that was beginning to change, and it did change in this period of what we might call the maturation of the 1980s and early 1990s. And this is a period when now there are more people writing in the social sciences and the humanities in particular, and they're being published now in mainstream journals. The graduate students are being appointed at institutions across the country, so there's more faculty. There's a greater presence at historical or sociological, anthropological, or other disciplinary meetings. And so this is an important period when, if we look at Chicano studies per se, it's made an impact. It's been partially institutionalized. It's on the verge of becoming institutionalized. That is, becoming a part of the fabric of a place like Stanford and other universities through the individuals who are there and the research that they're producing. And this last phase we might call the institutionalization of Chicano studies, of the presence of a diverse student body. A diverse student body. I had some photos, but I couldn't get a very clear image, so they were so blurry that you wouldn't have been able to see them. But I had a photo of a class from 1937 at Stanford, and a class in 1955, and a class from 2008. And I was telling the students this a couple weeks ago. That class in 1937 and that class in the 1950s could not have imagined, or the faculty at Stanford or the staff could not have imagined that there could have been a change so profound that Stanford would look more like American society in general, right? The diversity that characterizes our nation. And for me to look back, that is in the years I've spent in higher education, starting as an undergraduate in 1966 and as a faculty member over the last 34 years, I don't think I could have imagined, surely as a graduate student, and if you would have asked me in 1975 or 76, could you have imagined this kind of institutionalization, I probably would have said no, probably would take the next generation to actually bring that kind of change to the fore. But we've entered an era of institutionalization. It's not going to go away. It's embedded in the fabric of the institution. It's embedded in the culture of institutions of higher education. And when I look back, it is amazing for me to look back over these years now, to have played a role, to be a part of it, because my life story is intertwined inextricably to these stories, this history. And for me, of course, I'm a historian, so I always try to put it in the larger context. It's a story of a society that was grappling, pushing, and being pulled, its hair being pulled, and screaming for change, right? It was a society that had excluded people for hundreds of years, for generations. And its institutions of higher education had excluded people for lots of reasons, right? For lots of reasons. But the society was changing. It took a civil rights movement. It took civil rights movements, plural, to create the advocacy and the spirit of change that influenced more and more Americans to say, this is the right thing to do. This is important for American democracy, to open the doors of higher education, to let people have opportunity. It's a story fundamentally about opportunity, right? For people to go to an amazing place like Stanford and experience it, change it, and to be changed themselves by it is a remarkable thing. It's a story of training the next generation of scholars that will carry on the intellectual traditions already established at a great university, and perhaps create new traditions of scholarship. Students that, the third generation of these students will come to Stanford when I'm long retired. Although, Peter, since my 401k has gone down, so I may be teaching till 95, but if I can still read my notes. But for me, for the personal journey is amazing, because I always think about the intergenerational change and the sweep of American history. So for the son of a Mexican immigrant who left Michoacan in the throes of a horrendous revolution, had never stepped foot in a classroom, not one day. A mother who, luckily, she went to school, but the expectation for her was, you didn't go past the 6th grade. You certainly didn't go to high school, right? And a child of, 6 children, all of us who grew up in the barrio of Compton, and the very first people in our community that went to higher education, and to be in a position to reflect back on a generation of being involved in higher education and at this amazing institution, the opportunity that it afforded me, because I could not have imagined in my wildest dreams when starting here or being tenured when Peter Stansky was the chair, that my career would have unfolded in the ways that this amazing institution created opportunities for that to happen, right? So it's been fun for me to share with you some of these thoughts and reflections on Latinos at Stanford, and I'm glad to handle any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. For questions and comments, would you please use the microphone because it's being recorded. So there's a microphone there and there.
Two quick questions.
Yes,
Number
sir.
one, Chicano. Where does it come from? What does it mean, Chicano?
Well, there are several interpretations of its derivation, and no one knows for sure, right?
Really?
One is it's a contraction of Mexicano,
Yeah.
Mexicano. So when the Mexican immigrants come here, they cut off part of it, it becomes Chicano, right? And it's circulating in the barrios of Los Angeles and in Texas and Tucson. In the early 20th century, we can document this, people referring to themselves as Chicano. The Chicano folks who've come, they're no longer Mexican entirely, they're Mexican-American, but they're Chicano.
Second question, Mariachi Cardenal. When did the mariachi start here in Stanford?
Francis, do you know exactly when the mariachi started?
Yeah, 1995.
Okay. The ballet folklorico goes further back. It goes back to 70s.
The early 70s.
Early 70s.
First groups of
So the part of the cultural performance part, the mariachi is more recent, but the ballet folklorico goes way back.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions? Charlie?
I actually have three questions, Al. Can I ask three at the same time?
I may not remember them, but go ahead.
I'll start. I'll ask them in series then. The first one's simple. It's just statistics. What percentage of students now at Stanford are Latino? And how does that,
About 9 or 10%, just about every year.
Okay. And UCLA?
Well, it's you have to talk about post Proposition 209 for UCLA. I think it's less than 3% of the undergraduate population at UCLA these days.
Is that right?
Is Mexican American.
Is there an explanation?
Proposition 209, of course, as you may recall, prohibits the use of ethnicity, race, and gender for the admission of students in any California state universities and colleges. So basically, I can go. Well, I'll tell you a sad story, just an anecdote. Our daughter, our youngest, started UCLA 2 years ago. And in the class of, I think it's 4,600, 92 African Americans and 118 Mexican Americans out of 4,600 students admitted. So it's rolled back, that law itself rolled back admissions at especially the UCLA and Berkeley to levels that would have been, little, maybe 1969, 1970.
Wow. Where are those kids going to school now?
California state
CSU?
universities, and the large majority of Latino kids in the state go to community college and don't go on to four-year university.
The other question is about this evolution, if you can call it that, from inclusion, maturation to institutionalization. There are Latino faculty members. I know one, Roland Green, who teaches outside of the field of Latino studies per se.
Right.
Do you think that that's a subcategory of maturation, that as Latino academics enter their various disciplines, that they choose to enter disciplines which are not Latino specific, that are not self-reflexive, in other words?
Absolutely. So you recall me talking about the intellectual diversity of the students by the 80s, certainly the 90s. This is reflective of the faculty as well. Of the 52, so to put it one way, of the 52 Hispanic faculty at the university today, probably only 12 of us would teach courses that have an ethnic focus of any type.
The last question is personal. I'm intrigued by your number 43 and number 44. You and your brother and other siblings also went on to higher
And one
education?
several of them went to college. Oldest brother, he was 12 years older than me, was the first Mexican-American kid out of Compton to go to college. He went to USC on a science scholarship, but didn't last but a year. And then two other brothers went on football scholarships to the University of Utah and University of New Mexico.
So this was extraordinary from your community.
It was, yeah.
How do you explain that to yourself and to
people have
others?
asked me that, Charlie, and it's interesting because on the one hand, because my father, of course, had no conception of what higher education was at all, but he knew it was a good thing to be educated. He did not want us to be cement workers like he and all of his brothers were, right? Concrete workers. So he knew that education was inherently important, intrinsically important. And so we got that message, but it was not like, hijo, that kind of lecture. It was, education is important, stay in school. That was just the message that somehow was communicated. I attribute it to my oldest brother, really, because that was the unprecedented development. He was the first kid out of the barrio to go to college, right? And he was a good high school student. And at that point on, when he went to SC, that was the first thing I was a very little boy. I was like 9. And that was the first time that I had ever heard really about college. And I said, my brother's going to USC in college. They had a great football team, right? They still do. But it sank in that it was college. So by the time I was in middle school, I had already kind of convinced myself, I'm going to go to college. It was supposed to be Notre Dame, though, instead of UCLA. So I really attribute, and when I think about it analytically, my brother had a huge part in instilling in us this possibility to go to college. And then when the other two brothers, because I'm the youngest in the family, when the other two brothers, this is a gendered thing, by the way, well, the girls were not expected to go to college, although my oldest sister is the smartest person in the family, but she didn't go. She had to leave. She graduated high school, but had to help the family earn money, just keep the family together. But that one role, so it's basically, Charlie, it's a role model, right? For me, it was that role model, and then the other brothers gave me some additional role models, so that by the time I was in high school, I knew I was going to go to college. It was a question of where. Yes, or whoever.
Go to the.
Yeah, go to the mic.
Because it's being videotaped. My question was, do you anticipate a continuation of the maturation stage or a continuation in the institutionalization phase as we go along, or do you now anticipate sort of a return, I'm going to stay away from regression, a return to the characteristics that of the inclusion era in the future, in the near future, especially because of the waves of immigration from the late 80s, early 90s, and because of the way that immigration policies are shaping the entire population of the entire country. Mm-hmm.
Well, no, it's an interesting question because at the same time that you have, I think you'll have an increasing institutionalization, maturation, but as far as the undergraduate student population, places like Stanford, Yale would be another example of a very conscious effort to make that university be an avenue of mobility, right? So Yale, Stanford, Harvard, a number of the elite universities consciously want to admit students, the students who are admittable to Stanford, who come from those immigrant backgrounds, right? So there's going to be a greater diversity of that population that probably will experience some of the same things, but in a different context that pioneer generation did, right, in that first decade, but in a very different institutional context, right, because of all the institutional development that has occurred. So I think it'll be an interesting mix in the future of more students of immigrant backgrounds coming to institutions of higher learning at the same time that you have this diverse socioeconomic diversity of part of the student population. But not forgetting that those institutionalized programs, if you will, are there to support these students. And that makes all the difference in the world. Yes, sir?
Yeah. Given your experience here at Stanford since 1975, and thinking in terms of the fruits of that work in the Hispanic Studies area that go on beyond and outside academia, what would you say about those students and what they accomplish, or are they accomplishing and will continue to accomplish, do you think, with that grounding?
Yeah, good question. It's amazing what this university does for all of our students. I mean, it equips them with the the ability to be leaders. You know, we take great pride in training these students, both our undergraduates and our graduates, to be leaders in whatever field. And to see what some of these kids have accomplished is humbling. They are, in every career path, they have emerged as really important players, whether it be medicine or law or politics. One of the young guys I remember in the class of, I think it was 77, Javier Becerra, U.S. congressman from Los Angeles, and I remember him as this rowdy kid in some of my classes, but I knew he had a real talent, right? Went to Stanford Law School. So just an example of how this institution can propel not just the Latino students, but our students in general who go on and just do amazing things. And it's been one of the beautiful things to, as a faculty member, to see them go on and carve out their careers, and you know, those that come back and tell us what they're doing. I marvel at what they do.
Well, maybe I can reach the microphone here. I'll project my voice. That sort of emphasizes the expansion in terms of undergraduates. But I know, Al, that you've been very involved in the training of PhDs, and probably the premier trainer in the country. And I mean, would you make some sort of generalizations about the expansion of Latino studies nationally? Academically, but
right.
Based.
Good question. So the question about the pipeline, in effect, what happens to that pipeline? There have been more graduate students over time, of course, that have come to places like Stanford for training, and they go out and get appointed at institutions all over the country. Two developments, Peter. From what we had hoped to be a substantial expansion of the number of students, especially in the social science and humanities, has never really come to fruition. So their numbers are still relatively small, but they're out there. So every major university in the nation will have Latino scholars teaching ethnic studies of some sort. And that's a real change from probably the mid-'80s, maybe early '90s on. So whereas you would find most of these faculty, graduate students, young faculty, in institutions of higher learning in the Southwest, Texas to California, now they're in many other places. One of my PhDs, I don't know if you remember, Steve Pitti, is at Yale, and he's a full professor at Yale. And we have people at some of the Ivies, and so they've gone beyond the region and have gone to institutions of higher education all over the country. That was an important development because I think it also legitimizes further the field of study. But it's been slow and sometimes frustratingly slow to expand the pipeline so that there are more faculty out there, so that it isn't a task every time we have a search to identify these outstanding people. I've taken, as you mentioned, I've taken great pride in having trained, well, the largest number of PhDs in the field, in my field, in the country over the last year. But that's because Stanford permitted me, our department permitted me to do that. They allowed me and some of the other Americanists to admit these students, train them, and then send them off to these great universities. So it's, again, part of that institutionalization of the study of Chicano studies. Yes, sir.
When you came here in 1974, you mentioned that there were the group of students that came to all the meetings and were a community. And I wonder how you would compare that with the community today. Is cohesive a community, or is it important?
It's very diverse. It's very large. I don't think we could call a community meeting and have 600 students. Right. But you go to El Centro Chicano or you'll go to Casa Zapata, and you'll routinely see groups of whatever activities of 20, 30, 40, 50 students. So there's still clusters of students that see these institutions as really important parts of their lives. But because of the diversity of the undergraduate population over time, with more diverse interests, some that don't identify much ethnically, and that's fine, right? I mean, it's their prerogative. And others who deeply identify, and everything in between. So the community has gotten much larger just in sheer numbers. Sure. but more diverse. And the cohesiveness, you wouldn't expect to find a cohesiveness with that large a population in a place like Stanford. But pockets of cohesiveness, absolutely.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question, then we'll, Bill?
Since we're talking about Stanford history, I'm curious about your recollections of the faculty cohort that was here when you came. Who were your elders by name, if you have any recollections of them, and who were helpful in integrating you into this community?
Yeah, well, thanks for mentioning that. There were a few, right? There were a few. So the first faculty were hired in 1971, and you'll remember these names, and Peter will remember these names, some of you, Bill, others. Arturo Islas in English department. He was a graduate student here, and he was appointed, I think, in 1971 or 72. And then there was a Renato Rosaldo, an anthropologist, who was appointed in 1971. They were the first two appointed to Stanford. And then an engineer, Jim Leckie, who's going to retire soon, was appointed in 1972, I think. And dear friend Jerry Porras in the business school was appointed in 1973. And then along came yours truly. But these are the people that became, because we were so small a community, we were dear friends, and we were always plotting, right? Always thinking, how could we push the institution further? How can we, knock on the doors of the departments and say, look, we know there's a faculty prospect out there. So it was a very tight-knit group that coalesced around not only being among the few of our ethnic background on the campus, but we had hopes to try to change the institution.
And who was the first Chicano woman faculty member?
Let's see. Who would have been the first Chicano appointed?
And when would it have
Yeah, I'm trying now. You're testing the memory banks, Tessa. Let's see. And I'm blanking on her name now. She was here in the School of Education in the late 70s and early 80s. Anyone? Well, she was PhD from here before she went to UCLA, and she goes back to the 70s. And I think you're right. I think she was on the faculty for a year or two before she went to. I think that's right. I think Concepcion, who's now a full professor at UCLA School of Education, may have been. Now that you've asked that question, I've got to find that answer. But very few women, right? Very few women over time. Guadalupe Valdez, School of Education, Yvonne Yarborough Bejarano, but was appointed in '91 to Spanish and Portuguese. So there were fewer, and there were none in our original cohort of at least up to 1977, 78. Thank you for coming out tonight.
Alan demonstrated that